When you think of a Zelda game, what is the first thing that pops into your head? I'm willing to bet it's something a little like this. Or perhaps if you've got a bit of PTSD going on, it was something more like this. Either way though, you thought of something sound-related, didn't you? Since the beginning of video games, music and sound in games has played a huge role, and it's responsible for some of the most memorable moments in gaming history. But have you ever considered where these memorable little jingles come from? A few videos back, we discussed the evolution of graphical processing units in game consoles, from the history of these components to some of the major milestones that put them where they are today. In this video, we'd like to cover some similar topics. However, sound cards are way easier to understand than the average GPU. So we're going to introduce a new topic here. Let's talk about how sound cards actually work. A sound chip is pretty similar to a GPU, in that it's intended to take the binary ones and zeros produced by a processor and turn them into an analog signal us humans can actually understand. This code produced by the processor is known as digital data, while the actual sound waves we can hear is known as analog data. So how exactly does a sound chip go about this process? Well, to keep things simple, let's focus on some old-fashioned console sound chips, which were usually based around a simplified sound chip model known as a programmable sound generator, or PSG. These chips were, and actually still are, known for generating sound waves by synthesizing multiple preset waveforms. Let's say that you somehow managed to get Mario Maker onto your NES, and you finally finished that level you spent 7 hours making. This would make the game dictate that a certain set of sound waves should be mixed and played in a certain order to produce the "You won" jingle. The console's processor would then notice that you've won, refer back to the information on the game cartridge, and then relay the simple mixing data to the PSG's control register. PSG, remember, means Programmable Sound Generator. From here, the sound chip can tell which sounds to play at what volumes for what amounts of time, and bam! You hear something like this. Now that doesn't sound too complicated, does it? Just for good measure though, let's go over how a few different consoles process sound in their own unique way. Starting with the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600 was one of the first consoles to have any sort of sound chip. This specific sound chip was known as the TIA, or Television Interface Adapter. This chip was actually responsible for generating both audio and video signals. The audio portion of the chip had two separate voices, essentially meaning it could play two streams of preset waveforms at a time. Each voice had 16 units of volume control, 32 pitch waveform values, and a 4-bit control register. This means the chip could be sent 16 commands at a time by the processor, although due to the fact that it only had two voices, this was rarely taken advantage of. The NES's sound processing mechanism was known as the APU, or Audio Processing Unit. This set of circuits was still not a dedicated chip, and was built in with one of the main chips on the NES, known as the RP2A07. However, despite the fact that this wasn't actually a dedicated chip and still mostly relied on the simplified PSG sound chip model, it was one of the first sound chips to truly make sound and music in games a major component. The NES APU contained 5 specialized channels or voices, 2 pulse wave generators, a triangle wave APU, a noise channel, and a delta modulation channel. The 4 main channels create and mix preset waveforms like past generation PSG chips. However, that last one, the delta modulation channel, or DMC, was capable of playing simple audio samples from the cartridge. This kind of technology was unheard of for game consoles at the time, so unfortunately it usually went unused. Within a few years, however, this technology would become the norm, all thanks to the NES's simple DMC track. Even without use of this DMC track, however, the NES could still produce some amazing bits of music, while simultaneously creating atmosphere with multi-layer sound effects. For example, we first heard this incredibly memorable tune on the NES. Next, let's look at the Super Nintendo, which was one of the first consoles to contain not only a dedicated sound chip, but an entire dedicated sound module, complete with its own processor, RAM, digital to analog converter, and a more classic PSG chip called the SSMP. Thanks to these really cool features, the SNES's sound module was capable of some pretty unique things, and was often considered a coprocessor dedicated to sound. Rather than a simple sound chip, one of the most unique aspects of this module was its ability to be custom programmed by developers. Thanks to its dedicated processor, developers could actually write custom scripts to play their music and samples. This, coupled with the console's SSMP PSG chip, and its dedicated RAM, made it one heck of an audio powerhouse. We haven't talked much about bit counts in sound so far because, honestly, when we start getting into the more technical stuff as we've been doing, they become nearly irrelevant as far as game consoles are concerned. Essentially, when you say 8-bit sound or 16-bit sound, you're simply referring to the complexity and size of a given sound sample. So I suppose it's worth mentioning. The SNES was one of the first consoles capable of 16-bit sound. We're going to jump ahead to the original PlayStation. After the SNES, sound technology didn't jump much, although things did begin integrating back into single chips with all the same capabilities, rather than entire modules. However, this slowdown isn't at all because sound technology wasn't advancing. It was thanks to storage. Because flash-based cartridges were, and still are, so expensive, developers would skimp out on music and sounds in order to fit more gameplay and graphical assets into games. The PlayStation fixed all of this by being one of the first consoles to truly utilize the storage capacity and cost-effectiveness of CD-based games. This newfound space allowed developers to include actual voiceovers, long, pre-recorded songs, and hundreds of different sound effects to overlap.
Looks like I've got some things to do.
At this point, consoles begin to move towards more PC-like sound chips, and away from the simplistic PSG chips they'd been utilizing. So let's talk about those for a moment. Because these technologies have stayed relatively similar throughout the years, this should also give you an understanding of the sound chip currently allowing you to listen to my sexy voice. A standard sound chip contains two primary components: an ADC, or analog to digital converter, and a DAC, or digital to analog converter. The names do a pretty decent job of explaining what each component does, but let's go a little more in depth. A DAC is fairly similar to past sound chips we've discussed, in that it is responsible for taking the digital data from the processor and converting it into analog data we can actually hear. Earlier, when we were talking about sound chips capable of playing sound samples, we were talking about simple DACs. These components essentially work by creating a custom waveform by smoothing out the digital data. In this diagram, you can see the work of a DAC, taking the blocky digital data and turning it into a smooth, more natural wave to be output to a pair of headphones or speakers. An ADC is responsible for the other side of things, taking analog data from something like a microphone and converting it into digital data for the processor. They use fairly similar procedures to a DAC, but the inverse, of course. Let's say you're in a Skype call with a friend and you're both using USB microphones. If you say something, your microphone will pick up the analog data and send it via pulses of electricity to the ADC in your sound card. The ADC will then convert it into a digital format and relay it to the processor, which can then send it via your network card to your friend's computer. Their processor will then relay the data into their DAC, which will convert it back into an analog signal, which will once again be sent through their headphones via pulses of electricity, and all within a few hundred milliseconds. This new technology, coupled with the new CD-based storage methods, continued to allow developers to load more and more complex sound into games. So with so many awesome sound mechanisms in games today, can game audio really get much better? Although it may not sound as impressive as entirely realistic graphics or 4K VR headsets, future audio advancements will likely add to our gaming experiences in even more realistic ways. Binaural audio, also known as 3D sound, is audio produced by emulating exactly what your ears would hear in a real situation. Here's an example. Alright, now let's wait a second for everyone who took their headphones off to come back. So at this point you've probably figured out that there wasn't someone knocking on your wall. But this kind of sound realism is exactly what we could expect in the future of gaming. For example, imagine a first-person shooter where you can pinpoint exactly where every single twig snap or gunshot is coming from in true 3D space. It would be crazy, and in some ways, even more immersive than perfectly realistic graphics. Couple this technology with a VR headset and things will be unbelievably real. So again, where is this technology? Binaural audio can be recorded by orienting two microphones within ear-shaped bits exactly where someone's ears would be in real life. For movies, this is simple enough. For video games though, this is very hard to emulate in a computer due to the fact that analog sound moves in very complex ways. To get true binaural audio, a computer would need to emulate these processes perfectly. A computer would need to analyze 3D space, simulate actual sound waves bouncing around and off of different materials, which interact with the sound in different ways, account for manipulation by environmental changes or other sounds, air density, air movement, and basically everything that actually affects sound waves, and relay all of these highly modified sound waves back to two separate points, all in real time. However, the two main issues with doing all that properly are processing power and sound engines. The issue of processing power could be solved by integrating more powerful processing chips into our sound cards, or perhaps dedicating a small portion of our CPUs to sound emulation. However, creating engines capable of emulating all this is a completely different story. There are a few binaural sound engines in existence at the moment. For example, DICE's FROSTBITE engine has a pretty incredible sound engine that they claim can produce binaural sound effects. However, a quick listen will highlight the fact that these just aren't the same as audio actually recorded in 3D space, and unfortunately, this is about as good as it gets for the moment. However, we are moving in the right direction, with loads of new developers adopting the idea and realizing its true potential. If teams like DICE or any of the teams behind VR headsets continue with their endeavors, our games will likely sound perfectly real within the next decade, or maybe two. And I am very excited for that. And with projects like the Two Big Ears engine, which has been in development since 2013, binaural audio is already pretty far along. So when it eventually makes its way to games, it will most definitely be quite the game changer. And hey, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something today. Do you like videos diving into game technology? Well, I have some right here for you. And until next time, you stay awesome and never stop using that noggin.